The Waking Tree by C. Don McCallum. Chapter 7. Any more of that cake left? Jared craned his head around in the refrigerator, searching for a piece that he was sure he'd seen earlier. Yeah, it's wrapped up in there. Abra stared at the bubbling hot oil and shuffled around the frying chicken parts with a pair of tongs. Words exploded from the caustic, rolling grease. Words demanded liberation. They wished for a return to the cool air, bringing peace at last. The chicken pieces browned, and Abra flipped it to allow all of the sides to heat to a similar color. Should I be looking somewhere in particular? Jared asked. Without thought or interest, Abra shifted to the open door and placed her hand on the last piece of cake loosely wrapped in plastic. Handing Jared the plate, she returned to the hypnotic mumble in her frying pan. In the brownish yellow liquid, Abra found herself swimming. The molecules burst into and through her, wanting to possess her static warmth. Is that chicken going to be as dry as last time? Jared asked, taking a bite of the cake. He looked over her shoulder from where he was leaning on the opposite counter. The meat pulled itself from the bones under the distress of the intense heat. I'm hoping not. Abra's eyes looked beyond the wall behind the stovetop where she stood. She looked through the metal splash guard to the wood holding up the house that curved and pulsed at the sight of the man standing in the kitchen. Stay away from him, the wood told Abra. He'll try to destroy you and your babies like he did to us. It wasn't him, she tried to explain, her spirit springing from a particle of heated oil to the air above the pan, only to return to the scathing juices. And it wasn't Darnell either. They didn't do it. Jared poked around in the refrigerator again. I see you were busy last night. What came over you? Jared carved off a slice of nut-covered cheese, sliding it into his mouth. He set the knife and cheese on the counter. His cold, fat fingers eased themselves into his pockets and fumbled coins in the heat there. The lingering smell of the paint fought the scent of the frying meat and boiling potatoes. I got tired of looking at that old paneling. He couldn't understand her. When he opened the bedroom door the other night after he got home from work, she hadn't said a word. She just stared at the ceiling just as she stared into the frying pan now. Jared turned to his daughter sitting at the table. Josephine, did you have a happy birthday? Yes, sir, Josephine replied, not looking up from her shabby colors and wrinkled paper. I tried to get somebody to cover for me, he explained to her, but nobody would. You'd think some of them would want to make some extra cash. Jared cut another piece of cheese and slid it into his mouth. I would have thought that one of those Mexican guys would take my shift, the way they're always looking for extra cash. Couldn't get anyone. Josephine silently listened and pulled her color across the page before her. Abra looked up from the bubbling oil and gazed at Jared. He didn't notice her looking. I got that pretty picture you drew for me, sweetheart, he said, leaning up against the cabinet. He inserted both of his feet into one square of linoleum. His toes hung over the seam where the next tile began. Josephine looked up and smiled at her daddy. I like my baby doll, she said. Did you give her a name yet? Rachel. That's pretty. He straightened his feet on the tile. So you're sure you don't mind? I don't mind, Daddy. Josephine smiled at him again, letting her hand spread her colors all over the page. She does too mind, Abra had told him last night. Her words had cut through him. He knew she was right, but he tried to think of Josephine's look, the way she turned her head sideways, snuggled up close to him, and laid her head on his arm. She had smiled at him, too. I don't mind, Daddy. He slept hard that night. Then he woke up the next day to a fresh coat of paint on the living room walls. You sure made a mess in there. You think maybe you should have talked to me about it first, Jared said to Abra when he saw the living room and tried to imagine his father working in there. He tried to see the disarray that must have held the room captive, the scattered boards, the dusty floor. In his mind, he watched his daddy secure the wood paneling that he had made with his own hands. Those walls have seen too much, Jared thought. Abra didn't say a word about why she did it, about how she and Darnell could hear and feel the secrets the walls kept. Outside, the receding sun bled color from everything, even Abra's brightest flowers. Darnell's rubber baseball hit the outside wall like the steady ticking of a slow clock. The pendulum swung and thumped, banging slowly at the boy's hand, torturing his mother with the deafening noise of time. Though he struggled to hear his parents' words through the glass panes, he threw the ball faster during their silences, forcing the time to quicken during the tense, thick clouds of their stale breath that hung in the silence between words. Scabbed and sore, Darnell's body tried to eject last night's voices and images that he could still hear. They were just quiet enough to be lost in his thudding ball and his parents' long, simmering quarrel. At the table, Josephine let all of the sounds and smells wash over her, not resisting. I hummed and showed her how to make this kind of contentment, how to grow no matter what chaos surrounds you. Relax, notice what's around you, love it as it is. Jared slipped another, thicker chunk of cheese off his knife and asked, Josephine, what are you talking about over there? He walked to her side and peered at the paper she had before her. Nothing. I was just singing. She held the purple crayon tight in her uncoordinated hand, resting on the old kitchen table. Well, if you're just singing, that's not nothing, is it? No, sir, she answered. Josephine rolled the crayon between her palms, letting the waxy color filter through her. She tilted her face away from him. Rachel sat in Josephine's lap, watching the colors plant themselves on the paper. Circles, she thought she heard Rachel say. Make more circles that open up when they hit the sky. Josephine pulled her crayon around in a circular pattern, letting what she thought were Rachel's words escape in her own quiet song. She could hear the bubble on her paper, erupting open, setting my words free. Hold this bubble in your heart, Josephine, I sang. Its name is Wish. Mine was a language that Josephine could understand without even thinking about it. She heard it and understood. My words were a part of her blood. They lived in her lungs and paraded on her tingling fingertips and hid in her dangling strands of hair. This bubble's fragile, floating love is made strong by the music you let yourself hear. I thanked Josephine for listening to my bubble song, and I let her soak my gift of pretty colors and pretty shapes into her eyes and hands. She would save the purpleness of her new bubble for later when she would need it the most, she thought. I like your pretty singing, baby. Jared bit another piece of cheese off of the knife and listened to the deafening tick of the ball outside. Why don't you go see what your brother's doing? Jared said to Josephine while walking back to the spot where he watched his wife. She's fine there, Abra said, hypnotized by the bubbling oil. Josephine liked the pulse of the beating ball outside and let her crayons dance in circles and swirls of purple, blue, and red, and sometimes yellow, messages scribbled in a language known only to her. Someday she would share it when she learned to translate the images and sounds into words that could be understood by all. Though she enjoyed the company of all of her voices, their stories, she didn't care for the snakes and the air ducts. They hurt her head and her ears. But she figured out a trick to make them less scary. She knew the flittering voices weren't as loud and painful when there was music. So she sang. And she was happy that Darnell had found his own thumping song outside under the darkening sky. Aren't those potatoes about ready yet? Jared lifted the lid, letting the cloud of hot, salty water escape and disperse into the air, intensifying the scent. Yeah. Abra poked the rolling potatoes with a fork and reached up to turn off the burner under them, as if it took his declaration before they could be done. Jared paced, manipulating the coins in his pocket. Those coins sang their jingle song to Josephine coloring at the table above even the boiling foods, color conversations, and shuffling feet inside, above the banging and graying outside. She listened to the coins. Alone, we may seem so unimportant, but traveling together, we can rule the world, the change hummed. We can stop violence, hatred, lust, or we can start them, round and cold to hold in your hand, and when we grow too big, we can roll right over you. How much longer will it be? Jared asked, purposefully scanning the kitchen for nothing in particular. The noises of the kitchen and of the outside dazed Abra mesmerized her into an absent response. Maybe 10, 15 minutes. I still have to set the table. The coins whispered and rolled now in Josephine's ear. Together and apart, we have touched all of America. On the paper, she drew all of the places the coins had traveled. She saw them in her mind, drifting and changing like clouds. From hand to hand they passed, being spent. Josephine rolled her colors under her fingers, searching for the words to tell their stories. Brown, white, orange were the colors of their chaos. On her paper, the colors dashed to all corners and turned in on themselves. Where's Darnell? Jared paced into the bedroom, wiggling his fingers among his coins, feeling the different shapes, sizes, and various textures, then returned to the hot kitchen. Josephine scraped and rolled her crayons together on her encoded paper, stood and walked to glide the door open. Darnell, Daddy wants you. Darnell caught his rubber baseball and shrugged. Yeah, the boy asked, shoving the door aside as he entered the dim house. Wash up and set the table for your mother, Jared told him, still jangling his coins, pacing on the faded yellow linoleum floor. Josephine, he called and walked into his bedroom. The little girl followed. Go wash your hands, he called over his shoulder. She pulled herself up on the counter of her parents' bathroom with all of her weight on her midsection, letting her legs dangle. It was hard for her to breathe like this, but she liked being bigger and higher. The water flooded warm and soapy over her hands, and she watched her daddy in the mirror out of the corner of her eye. She could see him there in the bedroom, his back to her, emptying a full day's coins into a black sock. She knew where he would hide it, too, in the back of the drawer of his old dresser, the chest of drawers. She focused again on her hands and the water streaming over them. The dirty wax scent of crayons loosened and dropped away from her fingers down the drain. How long till you get to the river, she wondered, thinking of the night a few weeks ago when her daddy was working late and her mama took Darnell and her to Dallas, and they watched the giant ball of Reunion Tower roll in a swirl of blinking lights toward them, never arriving. They drove all around the city, seeing the lit ball of Reunion Tower roll from all angles seen from the inside of their car. Josephine's favorite view of the great ball was the one she could still see when they were driving away from it, as they passed over the Trinity River on their way back home again. Her father crept up behind her, hovering. That's enough, he said over her now. He turned the faucet off and Josephine hopped down, landing hard on her feet. The towel hung from his hands, ready to be taken. She dried her hands there, and he stroked her stringy black hair with his other hand. My mother would have loved you, he smiled with sad and focused eyes. The muffled words of the coins in the drawer now bounced and echoed in Josephine's head undeciphered. She smiled at her daddy intently and watched the floor pass under her feet on her way back to the kitchen. What can I do, Mama? Josephine asked her harried mother. You can go put your colors up and get out the milk and butter. She didn't look down at the little girl. Darnell, don't slam those dishes down so hard, Abra complained. The banging of ceramic against the wooden surface echoed too loud in her already dull, aching head. The pot of potatoes was heavy in her hands. Get me the salt and pepper, too. Clasping the lid on the pot, Abra drained the water off into the sink. The steam rose quick, burning Abra's hand that held the lid down and the potatoes in. She dropped the pan in the sink, and the melting soft, white potatoes tumbled. Be careful, Jared yelled. Abra picked up the lid again with her reddening hand and the pot with the other and set them together on a potholder on the cabinet. Gathering the loose potatoes that were resting and crumbling in the sink, she rinsed them off in the cool running water. Her burned skin craved the soothing stream pouring from the faucet. But Jared was watching her, so she threw the stray potatoes in the pot and mashed them with the mixer, pausing to add the ingredients that Josephine had laid by her side. Darnell put the last fork on the table with a pointed snap of finality. You can put some ice in the glasses, Jared said, opening the freezer door, an invitation to the boy. Josephine could hear the coins in the other room, and she listened some more. Muffled and nearly silent, they sang her name from the drawer in her parents' bedroom. All during dinner, she listened to their cries for freedom through her family's silence, while she watched her mamma's hand redden and bubble under the table out of the corner of her eye. The air said, on silver lips I try to rest, but the darkness is complete and no light will be shed tonight. I try to crawl inside to find a tongue, finding only facsimiles of tale-tellers and an unspeakable lust for fresh air and starlight. The drawer won't be quiet tonight. So much noise. Josephine couldn't sleep with it all swirling around her. The chaos was just far enough away that she couldn't make any sense of it. The words, cries, and struggles were dampened by the thick walls around her. The vital nature of the discussion flooded her head, and she ventured toward them, moving with the deftness of an earthworm through the thick, hostile air. She traveled in an undetectable silence like the earth as it spun around the sun that would soon light her world. No sense in her making things worse for herself by being out of bed this early in the morning. She concentrated on the perfect coordination of every appendage, every joint. Missteps and bumps in the pre-dawn darkness were not acceptable to her daddy. Most of all, she held her breathing back in a shallow flow, letting only the most necessary inhalations take place in the hallway where she stood straining to hear. Through the door, she listened to her mama run to the bathroom, her footsteps hitting hard on the ground, making the old house pulse and throb with her haste. Josephine cringed at the sound of her mama's suffering the hacking convulsions. Close the door when you do that, Jared growled. Josephine flinched at the ferocity of his voice, but remained silent. Her mother was crying, and she had to know why. Do you want me to get rid of it? Is that what you want me to do? Abra asked, weakened by her vomiting and incessant nausea. Josephine stopped breathing altogether to hear her mother's words. They were so far away. But the ceramic tiles of the bathroom threw the almost inaudible words across the room, through the door to her motionless body in the hallway. The tiles repelled all secrets and motions toward dishonesty, deception. I didn't say that. A rooted and impatient sigh launched out on Jared's words. I know we can't afford it, but what do you want me to do? Her voice was louder now, yet still weak. Her footsteps staggered in the bedroom. Josephine took a slow, rich breath, half for her body's nourishment, half to cover the sounds of frustration in her parents' room with the deep whisper of her nose. And in between breaths she heard other sounds too. At least the coins were silent. Perhaps they slept, or maybe they were as engrossed in the altercation as she was. But Josephine heard other stirrings, other voices from Darnell's room. A fight was brewing there, too. The walls that she had listened to her mama paint the night before were sending their vicious hum through the ceiling now, through the attic, right into Darnell's room. She thought she heard the hiss of serpents. Josephine could feel her brother's hands pressing hard on his ears, trying to keep them out of his mind. Then maybe they'd stay out of his body. Floating to his door, Josephine listened to the pressure building up, pulsing in his room. Darnell's door blew open. He shot into the living room. He didn't see Josephine in her eavesdropping limbo. Or he didn't care. She scaled the wall to follow him, breathing little. She had to see his face. Yes, he was staring at the wall, where the monsters snarled and hissed about a man's treacherous deeds through the thick coat of paint that covered them. She hoped they would leave him alone after their mama painted over them in her exorcistic fury. But there they laid, still and waiting, silent until this morning. Josephine drew in a deep breath, as if preparing for a long dive underwater. In the silence, she could still hear the anger of her parents' bedroom, Darnell's murmured terror, the drone of the air conditioner. But there was a new sound, a familiar frenzy of hateful desires. "We'll take your sister," the voices wailed in muffled unison. "No," Darnell pleaded in a long, drawn-out, tremulous injunction, scraping at his cuts and scabs and drawing fresh blood. "She'll serve us well." Darnell fell to the ground, his face flat on the floor. In almost inaudible cries, he begged for them to stop tormenting him. "No more," he exhaled all but his last breath. And then, "It's not real. It's not real," he chanted as the raucous beast shook and taunted him in a cruel dance from behind the painted wall. Darnell's words formed red and yellow clouds in Josephine's head and tried to strangle her with their wispy, wrangling hands. Their intentions were clear. She would be next. Josephine ran back to her room. She didn't care about the noise she made now. It was the safety of my branches that she sought now, to keep her safe and tell her stories. The beasts in the walls would want to dance with her next, throw her on the floor, turn her own hands against her. She feared their careless, wicked moves. Opening her window, she crawled out over the prickling holly bush and sat on the dry soil, trying to hear my words, my voice through the house's cries. A sickness almost overcame her, but she pulled the fresh air into her body, letting it expunge the hatred of the walls. The shock of such evils on her bones, in her blood and head, left her body hot and limp. She couldn't move. Trembling and searching for some coolness, she scraped the warm topsoil and lay down. She put her ear to the ground, unable to move her usually spry limbs, and listened for the earth's directions. She listened. I sang my soothing, rhythmic hum. The sun sprayed all varieties of orange on the horizon, letting the daytime's blue back out on the unreachable canopy of this little part of the world. Josephine lay groggy but watchful on the ground, slow dancing with the flowers that surrounded her. The colors, the sweet singing of the earth under her had swept away all of the crude visions that tried to force themselves on her frail body and scavenge her dreams. Her dreams of bird-shaped clouds would come true if she held them close in her mind. The front door slammed and Jared sped away in the car. Josephine's sweat and saliva caked the dirt on her face, and she found herself in the world again, the world where people lived too heavy and carelessly. She wiped herself mostly clean and sat listening to the waking, celebrating birds that watched her from high in the trees and on electrical wires. She wished she could sing like that. She could, I told her, but she didn't believe me. It was time to return to the frigid house where she would pretend she had never left her bed, not since her mama had turned off her light the night before. She raised the window. The cold knocked her back, bringing up goosebumps on her arms, back, and legs. Entering the opening, she heard the voices again, distantly calling her name. She looked around at the four walls. The white stucco bounced those words and ricocheted them, multiplied them. Let me out, they called, sending another, deeper chill through her. She eyed her pink and white canopy bed and imagined how she would ever get there through all of the words darting around the room. In her bed, she knew she would be safe. She could pull the covers over her and let her own breath fill her little cave. It's a trick, she thought, wanting to pull herself under her cool sheets. They just want me to set them free. Then she spoke. No, she said aloud and closed her eyes tightly. Josephine pulled her legs past the sill and shut the window. She flew to the safety of the bed. But the voices persisted. They tried a new approach, giving her a soft, kind feeling. The walls are trying to trick me. She thrust her pillow over her head and breathed loudly in a rhythmic pattern. Sleep, she thought, sleep. Under the darkness of her closed eyelids, she saw an old woman. The face lacked clarity, but it was familiar. It was the woman from the picture in the living room. Josephine had seen other pictures too when she was meddling around one day in the attic while her mama was sleeping and her daddy had gone to work. It was her grandma Bernadine, and here she stood staring at her in her faded blue flowery dress that smelled of lilacs and perspiration. Bernadine's hair framed her head in wispy silver and blackish brown. Get up, she said wordlessly. Josephine clenched her pillow tighter over her head. Go on, get up. The little girl opened her eyes and stared into the suffocating darkness under her pillow, but her grandma was still there, still commanding her to go. This is a trick, too, Josephine thought. My grandma wouldn't want me to get eaten up by those mean old trees, Josephine whispered to the apparition. My daddy said my grandma would have loved me. She wouldn't want anything bad to happen to me like what you're talking about, so just stop it. Go away. Josephine, Bernadine said, her voice calm and full of love. I do love you. Her words wrapped Josephine up in warmth like the one she had just left outside in the flower garden. Hot, she uncovered her head and breathed in the strange air. Now, go on. Bernadine smiled at her granddaughter. Before Josephine could even object, she was up and walking. She paused in front of her parents' bedroom. The voices were louder in here. Jared had left the door open in his hurry to leave for work. Her mama was sleeping. She still seemed to suffer, even in her moment of rest, from the trials of the night, the morning. Josephine imagined the smell of her mama's anguish, the vomit gushing from her burning throat. Bernadine urged her on in the corner of her eye, gentle and hopeful. Josephine peered into the room and watched the lump on the bed rise and fall. And the voices coaxed and begged for freedom from the inside of her daddy's dresser drawer. The coins called to her. Let me out, they pleaded. Josephine glanced at her mother again. Abra was limp and lifeless, heavy with sleep. The little girl tiptoed to the dresser and slid open the top drawer. She lifted the black sock from its hiding place and poured a few of the coins into her hand. The coins smiled in relief and briefly silenced their pleas when they looked up and saw her little face there. Please get me out. I can't move in here. Their stern, relaxed profiles eyed her and were relieved to be heard at last. Thank you, Josephine, the coins told her and danced in her hand. Their voices now had an innocence she had missed earlier. A frightened and trapped need to run and be outside of the drawer pulsed from them, and Josephine wouldn't let them be in there a minute longer. Today we can play together and tell you stories of when we were little like you, the coins told her. And Josephine's heart opened up a space for them to sit and rest. Her blood wove a fuzzy, soft blanket to keep them warm. She wished she could figure out how to invite them into the new home she was creating for them. Kneeling on the floor at the foot of her parents' bed, Josephine laid the coins in her lap and opened the mouth of the sock. She inserted her tiny hand, feeling the cool, mournful metal. One by one, as quietly as she could, Josephine pulled out the coins. She held up the front of her nightgown, creating a pocket, gathered them all, and stood. Scooting the dresser drawer closed with her shoulder, she stared at the coins and rolling, cooing, satisfied that their cries had been answered. Everything's going to be okay, Josephine whispered into her pouch of coins. We can go tell secrets with Rachel. In a corner of the room where the ceiling met two walls, a bubble named Wish tried to will itself into being so it could reflect Josephine's joy. But there wasn't enough water, and the soap was too far away. The air said, Shed lies thus far unrevealed. Show me the way to the vacuum of outer space. I'm even lighter there. Thank you for listening to The Waking Tree by C. Don McCallum. If you're enjoying this story, please consider sharing it with someone you know. And please like the video and subscribe to this channel to help others discover these stories.